Yeah, hello. How's everyone today?
Okay.
Pretty good. You said the computer analogy might be the most interesting one to focus on, but it's kind of the one that everyone's been talking about for like some obvious reasons. Um, but I think one of the things that was most interesting about the abstract was that you were going to talk about like the history of the analogies.
Yeah.
And you will talk a lot about the computer, but it was like the added context that I thought was most like novel and interesting.
I think I understand how I will center the computer discussion. Or like, I don't know, it's the big name thing everybody's gonna want to have their comment and say. It's been interesting to kind of go from there. I'm actually kind of interested in this paper that I saw in the chat. And also Bradley, well, kind of started in the middle of things here. I will. I know that we've sort of talked about this one before. I just was looking up the recording one, but we'll get to that later. I don't know. I don't read the paper, or when I did, I was so new I didn't know anything, so I would have to reread it. But this is the recording one with Eric Jonas that's been kind of talked about, like in Neuromatch and a bunch of other things. And it's in this section of things.
I want to know the answer. Can a neuroscientist understand a microprocessor? Yes or no? I can't tell from the abstract, which is a bad sign. The first word should be either yes or no.
Well, no, usually people will ask this is like the question, and then and usually it's like maybe not, but we don't know.
Right.
But yeah, like if you were to, instead of study the brain, study a microprocessor, but know nothing about a microprocessor, could you figure out how it worked? And so that's an analogy to the brain circuits and things like that. And, I don't remember what the answer actually was, but it kind of gives you, it kind of casts it in that light. It gives you maybe we get closer to some answer that's reasonable. I think they actually have real data in it, so it's not like just they're not just waxing about it, I mean, it's kind of a false question. Obviously, a neuroprocessor doesn't work quite like the brain. I mean, it's not really a network, for one thing. But the question is, if you knew nothing about a neuroprocessor at all, and you study the brain or you studied that like a neuroscientist studies the brain, you found it somewhere, you were like maybe 2,000 years ago, and you found a microprocessor somewhere, and maybe, would be kind of like the brain. They'd spend hundreds of years trying to figure out what it is.
Yeah, I was just thinking too of, there was a direction I wanted to take. There's something that I saw very clearly about a kind of social anxiety or like social pressure, particularly about this space. There's something to be connected more clearly than currently exists about pressures that affect both internal stuff, like kind of what the Parkinsonianism stuff that Norbert Wiener talked about, and there's physiological stuff, and also how there's certain, I would say, basically traumatic social interpersonal pressure and its relationship on regulatory processes in general. I'd be really curious to look into that space about, essentially, type this in the research rabbit or something later, like, what's the connection between highly pressured antagonistic situations and the impact on regulation, both from a mental on down to a physiological level? Like, different aspects of physiological, some just purely biological, some mental, some social, emotional regulations, like having really strong overlaps, and sort of not quite butterfly effects. I think this is a little bit too tropey of a word, but things happening in one space affecting other, but also not, and sort of the invisible illness part of what is seen, and then impacts that sort of latently or under less visibly affect kind of the tipping points for other things. So again, that's I'm speaking kind of particularly about it, but that's allusion to some of my recent history. So, with that in mind, for today's meeting, we can go over a little bit of my paper stuff, which would probably be good for me to do because there's something I haven't been able to update this lately. So let's review that briefly, and then things on my mind. I wouldn't mind kind of like, we kind of already jumped to talk about this a little bit, and I don't think there's really like a major conclusion to this paper. They kind of just go over, like, I don't know if there's an actual discussion in the non-preprint, but there's not like there's a discussion section here, but there's not like I don't know, conclusion or anything like that, it seems. But going over these two papers might be nice. And then other stuff. So I guess we'll start with where I'm at with this. I'm trying to let me just adjust something here. Hold on.
Okay.
Cool, it's done. All right, that's good. Let's get back to our traditional. We talk about brain laterality sometimes, but the most important laterality for our purposes is really the screen sharing laterality. If we don't have the notion on the right side of the screen, I mean, are we really even doing the reading group or not? So let's get back to the way things should be. Here we go. Yeah, I'll just do that for now. Whoops. Don't close this out. Okay. So, this will be an interesting paper. I don't know if I really like. I don't know how I feel about it yet, but I like parts of it. It's a little polemic feeling, but we'll get to that. It's kind of something I found today. But as far as where I'm going with this paper, I feel like I've updated it since this, so this is maybe even a little bit of a outdated take, but that's okay. Let's see what I wrote, because I don't quite remember it. Central tenet: what makes up a person or person experience change over time and correlated to comparative understandings of other devices, or in modernity, a device network and associated systems. I want to play a lot with sort of, I wanted to, I don't know if I will, but sort of this sense of technology and its accessibility within the zeitgeist, within the moment. What does that tell us? And some particular counters to that might be like, well, the Native Americans didn't have, they weren't like super duper duper. Okay, look at that. The seventh generation ideas, like there's certain like cultural beliefs that are much more time oriented that maybe affect that too, or at least affect the context, because I feel like one I don't know if I wrote it out here. An interesting dimension I'd like to look at is also sort of like relation to past, present, and future across generations. Like what is that? I don't know if I'm going to be able to find a lot about that. I don't think I will, honestly. But that's on my mind a little bit. Other considerations I wanted to say, I guess, were hierarchy, openness to expressions, gender binary, history of madness is like very Foucault's thing. Pre-science and post-science, which I've talked a lot about in terms of this book, Theory and Reality, Philosophy of Science. I guess I wrote a goal. I'd have to kind of clarify in my mind what's the tenet, what's the goal mean here, what's all this other stuff. Investigate how the view of the mind or what a person is or isn't responsible for related to their agency and capabilities, which is a very long phrase to break down, has conceptually changed over time or alternate wording, this might be, if there was a science of cognition across time and including today, what would it attempt to account for? I'm not sure how I feel about this yet. These are all kind of gestures and not fine-tuned wording that I'm going to finish with.
What do you mean by a science of cognition across time? Like what time scale?
I mean, like if there was a, I mean historically, not like
Okay.
across time.
Yeah.
But there, I don't like. I guess I'm saying like if there was a very clearly defined actual cognitive science, like ultimate form of cognitive science that actually does which I don't know if it exists or could exist, but if that cognitive science happened, or like was a thing, what would be the accessible parts in different eras that they were actually trying to get at? How do I say this better? Like the whole mechanistic period that kind of was around, like the sort of the pre-Enlightenment time, or like when science was coming about, Copernicus and all that other stuff, and this increasing mechanistic focus. Like, how would the ultimate view of cognitive science, or like, I don't know, I want to have a different term for it, but what would it like associate? What would it take? What would it say? Okay, when people were into mechanism, or like the advent of the mechanistic insights, what actually was like fitting or not fitting from the way it was being seen at the time, something like that. I'm not really sure. I think that's more of a stretch. There's something I can say definitively in the paper, but I'm kind of just putting it there for myself to think about. I think a facet. I think more. This is probably a little bit more like more for like actually what that goal could be achieved in this paper. Considerations in terms of analogy and comparative assessment or interpretation. So I think that kind of takes back to the main thrust of what the paper was about, which is sort of like looking at the mind as a blank, the mind as a whatever, past, present, and future sub-analogy is the mind, and so on. Let's see what I have here because I don't remember. Attributes or properties of the conception of the mind or self of interest. I'm saying like cross generations, past, present, future, a relation to broader social context, complexity of the object of reference. So purpose, mechanistic complexity, interaction, or feedback. Like does if like ancient Egypt and seeing the mind and the brain is like the vase, a vase holding something being held in the vase. That's not, that's a very, not really a dynamic or not really a heavily interactive thing. It's just a concrete object which holds something and has a space to be, something to be put into it, okay, versus a clock, versus a computer. This is sort of different along those lines.
Versus, and this is relevant to what you were saying before, so that there's the base in the computer, but it feels like agency should be on this list as an object of reference, like purposeful behavior.
I don't even know if I mentioned that here, but yes, it totally should be, because that's, in one sense, I could see the paper essentially being like, I could see a chart looking at these sort of dimensions and saying, well, oh, here's the base, here's the clock, here's the computer. What does it say about mechanistic complexity? What does it say about agency? What does it say about agent-environment interactions? You know, like those kind of basic embodiment things.
Yeah, I think fitting in the 4 E's here would be really interesting. Like how E'd are each of these metaphors defined, and in what ways?
I like that. Also, I'm not going to go there that much, but just because it's already a connection. So I think, geez, I don't remember when I made this thing, but abstract, intro, what properties we're looking at, why the historical framing chosen, where does this line of inquiry fit with the broader project? Broader project, I don't remember what I meant. It might be my bigger person studies thing that I told to Bradly recently, which I don't have a great name for, using that for now. But I think it also just mean how like this I think is maybe I should say, I'll put a comma here for myself. Let's figure this one out. Properties, which I think is going to basically be this up here that we just talked about. Historical context. Historical context is many of the things that I've kind of spoken about here. I listed out these sort of different categories about ancient Egypt, Greece, China. This is I'm not quite sure which I'm going to include or maybe make a simple chart or some figure or something or a way to kind of bring it in there. But then you get like mechanical, industrial revolution, there's computers, cybernetics, and like those kind of things. I want to figure out like a way of organizing all this that works and is sort of meaningful to the points of the paper. Some contemporary things I want to talk about. These aren't really in order yet. But contemporary things I would want to hit somewhere. The internet era and all the things I've been saying about modern day Norbert Weiner. I feel like what does this mean? This means I guess this theory of mind might be an easy way to say that. What happened to cognitive science and person studies? That's the paper I always mention from Nunez and stuff about where did cognitive science go? University, mental health, wellness, kind of things that we talk about often. Trauma and systemic exhaust. There's very much something here. Like there's something in this space that I'm going to be doing. I'm very slowly crafting out this stuff, and it's a little bit related to what I said a few minutes ago. There's a few things I might try to include or like mention as like future development for the research. So this might more go in the 7 part, but intersectionalism is really interesting this way because I found a book on it that I liked. It was actually intersectionalism as part of critical theory, and I think there's some avenues from intersectionalism, critical theory, and sort of like the way phenomenology has been considered a critical theory. Sort of the way of there's a really interesting approach to intersectionalism from some viewpoints. I'm definitely not ready to say all viewpoints, or even we talk about what intersectionalism is in an articulate way. But there's a really interesting sort of intersectionalism is interesting in terms of its unifying at a particular level of what I would consider systemic activity, while giving space for individual emergence of like consequence and things that shape experience. That's kind of fancy wording, and no, I'm not going to dive into it right now because it's a little. I think there's a way you could go all the way around this and focus on intersectionalism and the concepts of the person and analogies for a person or analogies for how a person works. And you can lead from that angle and do a really fun thing, which I might do later. But it's not. It's a little too. It's a little too much to center here. But I do like I might even. It's so messed up. Sorry for this noise. And looking at I'm sure someone's written in that space, and it'd be fun to kind of go from that away, but I don't know if we're going to get there. Analysis and discussion. I think I'm a little bit. One of the things I'm not quite sure for, like the analysis and discussion. Should analysis and discussion essentially be the contemporary matters or not? I don't know. Maybe these points are just the analysis and discussion. Contemporary matters is specifically contemporary computer and LLM analogies for the brain, like something like that. I don't quite know yet how I'm going to do that. And then other things. So that's kind of the vibe. That's the vibe of the paper. Any comments or questions so far before we go through the things?
I guess I don't know exactly what you mean by analysis and discussion, because I feel like that should be the bulk of the paper, because the context is like a philosophy conference. So not that you can't have the reporting of facts and the research into the actual different analogies. But I think I said some version of this before. I think that all of that should be geared towards a specific thesis. Like as you're sharing the facts, it should be in the context of something you've already like introduced.
Yeah, it does seem to cover a lot of territory. I mean, do you, you don't want to go in too many directions. So, you want to really kind of keep it a little bit tighter. I don't mean you have to throw out a lot. You just have to like make sure that you flow from one thing to another. That, maybe if you and maybe you want to change the focus a little bit from your original focus, because it seems like what you're doing here is you're going to maybe some views of what alternate sort of ways to think about the brain other than as a computer, and then you're going into some other things with Norbert Wiener and some of these other things. So just it's fine. It's just you want to make sure that it flows well and that it makes sense. It's getting to a point,
Yeah, I think the way that this is written is a little misleading to how I actually see the paper. I think what I'm imagining is basically making the thesis or the central point to be some version of this part here, and I just haven't figured out which way I want to say it. I still think the main thing will be these looking at these properties across time. I think that's going to be like the main stuff, and then some discussion about other things. Maybe this all is sort of this should be more like almost not necessarily further developments, but like secondary. So yeah, I don't quite have this in the right order, I think, but yeah, I get what you're both saying about it.
Like one version of like centering the evaluation would be like you could explain some past metaphors, explain the computer metaphor, and then argue that the computer metaphor is flawed in particular ways. Like one that comes to mind, because it's something I've been thinking about, is how the computer metaphor for the brain is often used in a way that's like strips individuals of their agency. Going back to agency, it like the impact of the metaphor and kind of like of the dominant scientific understanding de-emphasizes like individual agency. Like it's just the cogs in the machine, and any intervention is on like the physical or like the pharmaceutical level often. And so that's like impacted like the social conversation about like what it means to be a person. So I think that's had like really profound impact on the way we think about ourselves. And I don't have like good comparisons like the computers.
Well,
it's not like we like witnessed, I guess to some extent, like in things we've been talking about, witnessed like the brain used to be spoken about as like I don't know, we've mentioned a few old metaphors in the past, but so you could do that, but more like go further back in time and be more like critical and comparative. That's kind of what I had in mind, like when you first were describing the project.
And that's I think that is still what I feel about it. I feel like this structure is basically, in my mind, that what you said is basically what I'm aiming to do, and then this is like some additional like notes about what that is. But all the things that I don't list out are basically that. So maybe there should be yeah. In particular, like one of the points, and I forget if I said this in a recent discussion or not. part of why I'm playing around consistently with the philosophy, like the do I even have it here? It seems to not be here for whatever reason. Basically, the pre and post science stuff too. And I like one of the conclusions or things I'm going to put in the paper that I'm pretty sure on as being something I reach towards. Oh, here it is. Is some of the I think a philosophically interesting point for me that I haven't written out here yet is this sort of transition point from scholasticism, which is sort of that Christian and Greek humanities lineage, succumbing or being overtaken by science, and how basically its relation to sort of agency in the personal studies things too, because science is sort of this increasingly I don't want to say science is reductionism. I don't think that's entirely true, but I think one of the more right things to say is sort of examining when science happened. There was this it unlocked a lot in terms of what we call science, and we call break things down into these experimental things, what we call this so on, and that shifted some things and opened up all this enlightenment stuff and egalitarian liberté and all that these things that led to some of the comments about what people are and potentially good versions of that. But I would really like to, and I don't know if it's something that I can suggest or point out through some of the analysis of these properties in the papers, which would be a little bit, if I can do it, if I can back it up, I'd really like to do it. But basically saying in that transition, even coming up through a lot of the modern stuff in computers and cybernetics and so on, there's sort of I think a lot of the, put it this way, I think a lot of like the Borrellian lineage, a lot of like the embodiment, a lot of the pushing back and holistic take on agent and environment stuff is trying to sort of reconnect to some to some of the space where it's kind of going against the grain in an important way. And what I would really like to be able to do, if I can, is point out how a lot of these things of the advent of more accessibility and understanding of technology at like a social cultural level helps give context for seeing a lot of what hasn't been seen in this regard. So yes, I don't think these words here don't really convey things very well. I think much of what Amanda said and what I'm trying to do with other parts are kind of what do I weave with these other threads? But that's that will be my goal to put it together something a little more tangible going forward. So anything else before we move on to other stuff?
Nope.
I don't think so.
Okay. Maybe I'll quickly walk through parts of this paper. It's not super long.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And it's a little
Where is it?
I don't know.
Where does it come from?
What's that?
I mean, what is it? Where did it get published, or where is it from?
I don't. I'm a. Let's see if I can find. I kind of think it's honestly just like a preprint. Like I don't think it's a real.
Oh,
Okay,
it's
it looks like it was in whatever journal this is. I guess.
yeah.
I don't know what it is.
Well, I think it's a server for a university or something. It's like a repository for some. Yeah, it's probably media studies oriented.
It feels a little not hardcore philosophy of science. Like it feels a little. I don't want to be disrespectful, but part of it feels a little sort of like undergraduate polemic in that sense, which I've written. You know, I'm not saying I'm above that. Most of my writing is that, but you know, like there's some interesting. Like some of it feels really good. Some of it feels like the way hubris. And maybe also might be just translation. I realize because I'm seeing this as sort of like a German stuff, perhaps.
Oh, it was translated from German or something.
I'm guessing it was.
Yeah.
What's the deal that I tell us? Yeah. Can I just get a translation of these? Oh, okay. Not what I want for that.
I think I found the author's website, and he has a book called "How Not to Network a Nation: The Uneasy History of the Soviet Internet."
Is it this one, peters.org?
Yeah.
Okay.
Looks like he writes about tech. I think I also saw that he wrote like an introduction to a volume on cybernetics.
So a lot of society and culture stuff. Okay. Embodiment war and the curious absence of anthropomorphic AI in the Soviet Union. I mean, this is kind of a cool perspective. It's definitely a little.
That sounds made up.
What does?
Soviet anthropomorphic AI.
Oh yeah. Well. Anyways, yeah.
Like this part feels a little. I don't know what. The neurohubris of the computer brain analogy is helped to create. Like this paper, from what I read of it, I didn't get to read all of it. I read some of the conclusion and got through like I don't know, half of it or so. This paper looks a bit at John von Neumann and kind of says how he really like he kind of pushed for a lot of this you know, maybe it's stuff that would be interpreted in sort of transhumanist ideas of being able to upload your mind to the computer or whatever, that kind of whole post humanism, perhaps, like post body stuff. But also saying like he doesn't buy, like he didn't actually like commit to that fully. Like he rejected that, you know, or something to that nature. In his deathbed lectures, he grants certain aspects of the analogy absolute implausibility. Distance between neuroscience and computer science is growing more obvious since, you know, his writings at the time. This essay explores one moment in how 20th century information scientists and technologists came to situate designs on human behavior and computing, cognition, communication, discourse, and in the process encountered the limits of those designs in the computer brain analogy. He kind of comments on superintelligence and this sort of this ever increasing stream that there's something really nice. I forget what it is, but like basically the mind and the machine collapsing into a singular reality, right? The computer and the brain being this they're the same eventually. He mentions Helmholtz, mentions nervous system and transmission logic. And that was just kind of interesting worded. In the late 19th century, while commentators at the start of this century see democratic intelligence leavening cryptocurrencies and blockchains of distributed ledger centers to many current smart data imaginaries throughout the annals of the 20th century that connects two examples. Dual images of the computer as a brain and the brain as a digital computer have proven hardy perennials for imagining new class of superintelligent creatures, or as Vernon Vinge put it, eminent creations of entities by technologies greater than human intelligence. Human attempts to mechanize the mind go back a long ways. He mentions von Neumann, Alan Newell, Edward Simon. And so he's kind of setting this up here with, okay, we're going to go back to Descartes, and he's going to say mechanistic blocks, kind of this drag at sort of saying for the aristocratic 17th century Europe, as models of psychological capacity. Indeed, the fact that they could reject these devices as mere mechanisms suggests that I don't see where the end of the sentence is. At a basic level, the emergence in the modern naturalist philosophical perception soon championed by Thomas Hobbes against Descartes. Okay, this sentence is moving a little bit. That cognition and mechanical designs might share in a prescient seeding of Darwinism revolution to come, and irreducibly materialist nature, where Descartes sought to police the boundaries of humanity more closely. For Hobbes, all intelligence and blah, 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 is the product of mechanism, and the mind is a matter of fit for thinking. Does anybody know what Bletchley Park is a reference to? Perhaps the difference between the monarchy and Leviathan and the Colossus computer of Bletchley Park is not so great. Okay, the
principal center of the Allied code breaking during World War II.
So, he touches upon some other things here. Talks about Babbage, building logic and some stuff, electrobiology. But I kind of like this part. So it kind of like I like some of the things he's trying to get at, and I'm not sure what I feel about his ultimate views yet. But suffice to note that each of these actors appears to have understood something that is all too often lost in contemporary debates about computing the mind, namely that artificial intelligence has long been, and even in the current moment of machine learning breakthroughs, largely remains fundamentally a philosophy, and a humane philosophy at that. For that reason, it is not a mistake, I argue, to welcome in the history of mind-computer analogies the broader family reunion of natural philosophers, which is kind of appealing to me. I'm not quite sure I like what he's doing, but a lot of why I keep mentioning the Theory and Reality book and what happened in the scientific sort of revolution, I think is sort of this natural philosophers as a way of thinking that kind of is diminished in certain ways, but so natural philosophers, political thinkers, ethicists preoccupied with the question of designing human cognition, in particular what we learned from how humans, moral creatures we are, have confronted with the limits of human cognition in designing the very automations set to overcome those limits. Okay. And so then he focuses on von Neumann here and gets in his background. interesting commentary on him as he wasn't sort of your. I almost feel like he's saying he's not your classically autistically coded hyper genius who has no social skills and isolates himself and just wants to study equations. But he was, three-piece suits and off-color jokes and stuff like that. Okay. He's capable of counting everything but his calories. Right? According to his wife, I guess. Yeah, he's involved in the Manhattan Project. There's a lot of like. He talks a lot about, he how his study of a lot of flair in the author's writing about. Oh yeah, he was exposed to atomic stuff, and that's what killed him. And what does that mean? Von Neumann's final published work brought together an issue of computers' minds, and given his irradiated failing health, mechanized death in his prestigious sermon lectures that he gave at Yale University, which is posthumously published in 1958 as the unfinished book Computer and the Brain. In this work, some interest in imagination for artificial immortality, coming generations will all strongly on the mathematical foundations laid by other scientists, such as McCulloch, Weiner, Millers, and Ashby. Bone cancer. Given the urge to transcend death, this is a little flowery stuff. What rings obvious from his lectures is that for him, never did the digital computer appear much like the brain, nor the brain like a computer, despite his best attempts to analogize the two. But von Neumann, at the same time, often credited with sparking interest in the electronic brains revolution, could not even bring himself to believe the comparison between the digital computers and human brains was ever much more than that, a comparison. And it kind of, I think what he gets at here, or goes into basically, well, I guess I'll say here. This essay, which summarizes lectures in the context of his text, lays out historical and theoretical commentary on the computer-brain analogy and is proven resilient as it is misleading. In particular, it is precisely the felt mismatch in von Neumann's book between, on one hand, the impulse to couple computer and the brain, and on the other, his faithfulness to reason and evidence that renders him capable of active doing so, that stands as a moving witness to the intertwined character of the transhumanist instinct to transcend death through technology, as well as antithesis going through whatever going commercial. So, I think that a lot of this is very. I don't want to say prosaic, but kind of like evocative, which I'm a little less interested in that. But I think what was appealing is a little of the, I think it's interesting to think, and I don't know enough about von Neumann or what he said, what people think, but sort of like von Neumann sort of cited as this reference point for, okay, yeah, we're going to go into this transhumanist future, and brain is a computer, brain will be a computer, brain will be uploaded to a computer. But at the same time, it seems to be questioning, like, is that actually what he felt and what he thought? And I think there's some interesting comparisons there, regardless of kind of whatever said. I don't know how much more we want to go into reading these details. We can, but like I feel like there's sort of I could see it being something similar to, like, when you hear Norbert Weiner and cybernetics, you think, oh yeah, cybernetics, computers, and if you didn't study Norbert Weiner's sort of like political views about things, or what he actually did, you could say like, oh yeah, he was Norbert Weiner, the founder of cybernetics, information age. He was, he paved the way for cyborgs. He paved the way for this, transhumanist stuff. And I think in like reading the book we're reading, he didn't hide his views, but like a more nuanced and full view of Norbert Weiner would be someone who's very skeptical and worried and considered about some of those things. So kind of that disparity of von Neumann, founder of all this other stuff, versus what was it thinking, and particularly the analogy, did he actually want to say the brain is the computer, or just comparing it to it? Let's see. I'm trying to get what he's saying about this. The most significant and elected part of the famous title, "The computer and the brain is the end." The two terms are not even approximate equivalents. In the text, von Neumann never concludes the brain resembles a digital computer, except in the most surface ways. Much less so does he argue the digital computer is brain-like. In fact, he spends a clear majority of his text distinguishing between the brain and the computer, which quite reminds me of essentially Norbert Wiener as well. My famous quote that I've shown several times here is like, "Oh, the brain and the computer are different, and it's like a single run versus a long set of runs. And this affects the psychology and like the psychopathology or something of it, psychiatry of it, so on." Natural artificial organs, natural artificial automatons. There's a lot of things in this space that remind me a bit of our past work. I'm saying it's mostly to Bradly, find like ANNs and BNNs, biological versus artificial neural networks. And I feel like it's interesting because I'm saying all this and I hear in my mind stuff that was said at CBN 10, the like background, I guess, still here, about in the techno optimist crowd, there's a lot of oh well, we're seeing that there still is some overlap, but there's similar mechanisms for how certain things, and one of the people, I'm learn this now. Jeez, I should have put it here. What's this one? Yeah, one of the folks said, I think it might have been Hinton. Was it him? Both Thomas Poggio and Hinton were talking a little bit about Backprop, and one of them was saying, I think Hinton was saying, I don't think the brain's doing back propagation, in the way that computers are, but is it doing something like that? And he said, I would love to ask GPT-20 in the future, is the brain doing something with Backprop? So I think that's kind of an interesting thing that's still there. I think Poggio was saying, it's unlikely to be biologically plausible, but how does the brain do something without backprop and gradient descent, like these sort of classic machine learning bedrocks to things.
Yeah.
You want to say anything about that, Brian?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I have to admit I've never really understood exactly what backprop was. I've always thought of it as some type of feedback, but I'm not really sure I'm correct on that. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that, the best person to ask for that is Hinton, maybe. I don't like, the current people who are on tour. Maybe the best person, and I don't know what the answer would be. And and then this idea of using engineering tools to sort of get at the brain. So these are the tools that we have. It doesn't mean they're the best tools. They're, of course, also we have these sub analogies. So we've talked about the computer as a brain, or the brain as a computer. And then we not only have that, but we have these sub analogies. So like, the brain is an optimizer, that it optimizes things, maybe energetically, or maybe, informationally, or maybe even like, behaviorally. That's been a theme of cognitive science and cognitive psychology and all that. And it may be that maybe there isn't like this optimal mode that exists biologically. Maybe that's just the best way to describe what we, like learning, it's the best way to describe what's going on, the best way we can replicate it. So, I mean, I don't know, like there are a lot of things. Okay, that's a backpropagation of the brain. So yeah, Hinton, it's his review article with some co-authors. They talk about credit assignment and things like that. Yeah, so yeah, maybe we can cover that at some point. But I guess my take on this is that you have these, these analogies like the brain is a computer. You have these sub analogies where like we use engineering tools or mathematical tools to get at what we think is going on with learning or how we can at least reproduce it. So, you reproduce things all the time in the world. Sometimes you build models of things with wood or with metal. Sometimes you try to put as much detail in as possible or not, and it looks like something that is a replica, right? And then but doesn't replicate every aspect of it. Nor does it maybe it isn't exactly the way it would work in the actual model. So, like if you move a marionette, you move strings. But of course, our body doesn't work by just pulling strings. It's not quite that simple. There's a lot of control underneath that. And so, that really kind of gets at maybe one of the things that when we apply mathematical tools to something like the brain or something like the nervous system, that's, it's worth asking, is this, this approximates things, and that's what we talk about in science and engineering. But, is this, is that maybe the best way to actually get something that's, biology isn't actually doing that. It's just that's a good way to approximate it. So, that's yeah.
One of my biggest things on my mind lately, and I'm sure someone's written about this, and if not, I would love to invite us to write something about this, kind of for our purposes, but also like I feel like there's a way to do this. There's a way to address this at a broad, like overarching philosophical level, and there's a way that's like would be really pertinent to either conditioned futures or the brain analogy or whatever we're doing. And I don't know which I want to say, but to get to my headline here, everything Bradley said, and some one things I've been saying, it kind of comes down to this line of like intelligence, kind of in quotes or not, is not life or living, and then sort of there being an optional question mark to that statement. Like either is it a statement or is it a question? And differentiating, like I've said this many times here, but just to reiterate, I feel like the kind of the quirky thing about a lot of the machine intelligence or maybe artificial intelligence talk, which stems a lot way through. And part of my interest again with the book Theory and Reality and the science, the transition of science too. There's some connections that go way back into that time too, but also sort of before it. Biology, natural, what we call natural intelligence, is a very long lineage of things that were primarily focused on the struggle of existing and like maintaining existence. And intelligence emerged alongside that. Like I hear Michael Levin saying, "Oh, people always want to find this like turning point in when did intelligence emerge?" And he often says things like, "Well, the roots were always there. There's this long process of it developing, very much this kind of holistic, like emergence is a long process." And I think it's kind of very against the grain to look at modern day machine learning as something that's completely not based on, it does things that are completely not. There's not the physical limitations of computing exist, but those limitations have much different constraints on there is an existence pressure in the same way that there has been for biological quote unquote intelligence or the facet of biological functioning that is related to or affords or kind of that component of biological stuff that we call intelligence. So I feel like that is another very interesting space too.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, I have another comment about, this goes back to your paper. So we talked about the sort of the shift from classicalism to science and how that affected some of these views. But then at the same time, you also had, especially with Darwin onward, you had this gradual sort of dismantling of this idea that humans were sort of both at the center of the universe and sort of the supreme being. And so, a lot, but, you look at a lot of like AI and even neuroscience to some extent, and there's still this attitude about like humans being sort of like these higher organisms, or, like the human intelligence is the thing that's like at the apex of something. So, I mean, this is something, and then there's maybe something above that, which is like computational intelligence. So those views are still there. It's just kind of they're ancestral. They have like roots in other eras, or they have like, maybe it's not the right way that, like, say, a biologist would view the brain. If you were thinking about like a comparative biologist, or maybe it doesn't lead from like this trend towards thinking of human intelligence as maybe insignificant in the course of the universe, or different types of intelligences that you might find in nature. And yet, you a lot of people pose their questions as how can we have an intelligent system, and they always default to the human case. And then there's this idea that we can build like a superior intelligence with an analogy of human intelligence, and it ignores a lot of things about the natural world that are sort of there. And I mean, there are people who do that kind of work. There are people who build biomimetic robots and things like that, where they don't actually draw from those suppositions. Actually, I think it's interesting, we talk about the brain as a computer in cognitive science, but like in other areas, I guess, people kind of think about maybe like if you were studying in, trying to do bio-inspired robotics with insects, would you think of those brains as a computer? Maybe. I don't know if anyone surveyed that. What's the thinking in an area like there are other areas where we kind of assume that the brain is a computer, but it interfaces with other systems. So I mean, there I don't know what the diversity of views there is, but the view of the brain, or the view of kind of this sort of idea of what we've been talking about is really kind of, it almost has its roots in classicalism in some ways, because it supposes that humans are sort of special as animals in the animal kingdom, and that the intelligence is somewhat sort of at the apex of things. So it's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, because I know I've heard you. I think you even said like, in the last Saturday or Sunday meeting, like you're kind of you how do I say this? Like you kind of said you're kind of maybe take some issue with like the idea of higher or lower intelligence, higher or lower functioning. And I guess my question is that I'm not sure. I think you stated it, and I just don't recall it or can't put it together. So with that in mind, do you see like the I'll use the CBMM AI super tech heavy people. How do you see their focus on like trying to totally not well, and let's say the potentially I want to say extremist, but extreme view that the brain, like let's not even think about the brain anymore. Let's just focus on building. Kind of like the Richard Sutton bitter lesson on steroids view of let's just totally focus on computational intelligence. Like, do you see that as like a worthy critique then of the classical human-centered stuff, or how do you feel about that part of it?
I don't know if about worthy critique or not, but my problem with higher and lower intelligence is that it supposes this sort of scala natura view of intelligence. That is, if you've ever seen the image where you have like a monkey and then an ape and then a caveman of some type, like an early Homo, and then like a modern human, and there's this implication that it's a straight line and that there's a progression, so there's progress in some way. And this, I think, leads us down some blind paths with respect to like, that our intelligence is purposeful, that it ends up at this perfect state in humans. And we know that our cognition is not perfect. We can't do a lot of things. And that, there isn't necessarily this, purpose is kind of one of these things where, you're like, well, is there a purpose for our cognition? Because you think, well, it's, we've interacted with the world and we've kind of evolved these, pieces of cognition as humans, and they're great, and we should replicate them. Well, the problem is that something like attention there's a lot of diversity in the animal kingdom of attentional mechanisms. It doesn't just come from like the great ape lineage or the Homo lineage. It comes from like at least mammals, probably vertebrates, maybe even beyond that. And so there are a lot of different variations across the tree of life of these different cognitive mechanisms. And so even like with language, you have analogies with birds and their ability to produce song. And we study that to get a handle on language and things about language learning and how it's connected to motor learning. So, we have all these different, like, first of all, our intelligence is rooted in phylogeny, which is pretty deep. We have, of course, some organisms that have many more, flashy, intelligent behaviors than others. But those, it would be a mistake to just kind of say, like, human intelligence is the apex of intelligence and that things evolved for our, to benefit our interactions with the world. And we should take that as like a cue that we should just, build the next step of human evolution, or, there's something like that. You have other organisms that interact with the world in different sensory modalities. You have other kinds of mechanisms depending on their specialization of their behaviors that are very acute. So sometimes they have high sensory, ability, heightened sensory abilities. Like I just, in the talk I gave at Bika, it was, where I was talking about humans and flies and how it's hard to swat a fly.
Yeah.
That one of the reasons for that is because flies have a much, much higher visual acuity in terms of sampling their environment. And so they can keep track of things. Of course, they don't have the planning capabilities of humans, but if you look across species and how they interact, you may have these trade-offs where, one species has a much higher rate of sampling the environment, but maybe not as much of a planning apparatus, which may, I don't know. I didn't quantify these things for the trade-off, but I'm just kind of making a statement about these trade-offs. So maybe that flies actually do plan, and they do have mental models for like integrating information, but it's not, there are things that we've kind of evolved on our own, and sometimes they're not related to like optimizing our behavior. Sometimes they're just things that need to be there. Other times we have things called, there's some people like to think of the brain as sort of like this, I don't know if you've ever heard of the paper, The Spandrels of San Marcos, which is by Stephen Jay Gould and some co-authors. they published, I think, that in the 70s, and they talked about how if you go to this cathedral, you see like architectural elements that are sort of vestigial, that they don't really serve a purpose, they don't serve a function, but they're there in the design. Yeah, here we go. And so the idea is that they actually critiqued adaptationism, where everything is an adaptation. Everything, and what they're arguing is that, well, you have things that are, ancestral, or maybe don't have an immediate purpose, but are there in the, uh, you know, animals' phenotype or their architecture, and then you build things on top of that, like adaptations, and the whole thing, of course, is that you may have something that's adapted to some function, like an attentional system that's been honed for, hunting at night, but you also have elements in there that aren't particularly adaptive or optimized or um, purposeful. They're there because maybe your distant phylogenetic ancestor had those things in the brain. So our brains, mammalian brains, are very similar in a lot of ways with each other, and so sometimes you have things that are there, and I don't want to get into this lizard brain crap because that's not what I'm talking about. But it's just kind of, you have things that you inherit from your phylogenetic ancestors, and the brain sort of builds upon that and builds things. Sometimes they're very much adaptive. Sometimes they're maybe less adaptive because they have to work with the sort of the hardware or the architecture that they have. And so that's what they talked about in that paper. They didn't focus specifically on the brain, but I think there have been people who've written papers focusing on the brain specifically. And so that might be worth pulling up. But the point being is that, we don't, this view of like optimizing everything, or that the brain is adapted, that human brains are sort of adapted to high levels of intelligence, and maybe somewhat true, but only in general sense. And we need to understand that if we want to mimic biology and really understand intelligence overall.
Yes, and I think this is an excellent point to. Whoops, hold on a second. Yeah, I'm so glad this part of the conversation happened, because I feel like that's where I want to go with a lot of things. Like, I think some of the person study stuff is about that. Some of the neurodivergent stuff is about that. And some of just like, I want to break, and maybe this is some paper for us to write, either part of this thing or not. I want to really explicitly get at that in terms of, there's still, I think it was well said here. We talked about like Copernicus and Darwin and this sort of slight movement away from that. And part of why I keep referencing the science, the scientific revolution, whatever stuff, is that there was some movement forward, and I think there's some really interesting ballot, like the hurrah, we've overcome the dogma of blank, of Earth centrism and some of the scholasticism and classic stuff. Yes, but and particularly, I would say, particularly in a, not to be like completely DEI, diversity, intelligence, inclusivity, maybe belonging too, but like particularly the element of the people who were doing that stuff and what it meant to be a human. There's sort of a related, I think it's quite related to this directly, in the sense of there was this freedom, this enlightenment, but it was sort of incomplete. And a lot of what we're talking about here is, okay, we have done this, and we have, and like one of my major theses that I would love to write about is, we have so much really, really great. We have the cell phone, the computer. We have this great, powerful, massively developed technology, and I think there's such a strong illusion. Everything we just said, like, is super implied or not really overt. When you have this overt, like, technological wonder in your hand, and there's sort of this, I think there's this like cognitive pressure or like self-conception person, like, oh, well, we got this cell phone, then all of our other ideas about a person are also like maxed out and like at that level. And that's like the more I go, like the story of the last 5 years of my life and the level is just like, holy crap! Like the disparity is huge, and like you have like it's kind of this like almost weird pressure to act like everything is super far along, and I just like no, it's not. Like it's like the models are very, and it's hard. It's not saying it's easy. Just the models aren't there. The actual understanding of the nuance and the degree of everything we just talked about is still at a very like it all feels it's esoteric, and it's like why is it that way? So that's a whole branch to go down some other time. But like I'm really interested in all this stuff. I want to write about that because I think that's everything we just said in the last 30 minutes is like a major set of points and directions that I want to flesh out more over the course of things, and some of it may be directly related to the Cognition Futures project itself, but some of the things I want to do like in the others like bigger, some of the person study stuff that I'm alluding to very poorly is this stuff. So I don't know how to really. I'm working to build out the project structure for all of that, but like if that's of interest, I know we're trying to talk about here already, but like please like reach out about that as it comes up too. So we're out of time today, and here I am thinking like, oh gee, they will spend 20 minutes in this paper and it'll be a short meeting, but nope, we still have to get in everything because we have so much to say about it. What do we want to do next time? We didn't get to talk about Amanda's paper at all, so I think we'll just do that and maybe finish. It has some interesting points like cybernetics stuff that maybe we'll retouch. So maybe we'll finish this and do that next time, or what do you want to do? What do you all feel for next time?
That sounds good to me. I'd like to do the Foros paper. I read it. It was good. It had a good kind of like summary of some things that won't be too new to us, but then kind of like how we were complaining about the other paper and it's lacking. This one kind of posed like interesting challenges for Rella. So yeah, I think it's worth a meeting.
Okay, let's do that. And I will challenge myself to actually integrate everything that I thought about with the. I always appreciate Amanda because you summarize my words really well and remind me of the stuff that I really mean. So I appreciate you saying that. But like having that stuff and then Amanda's like really helpful remarks and then what I actually mean by this, which I think was kind of misleading, unfortunately. Into something that so some
be like connected.
Yes. But no, I appreciate that. Let's look at this next time and finish the von Neumann polemical piece. I don't know what to call this. But yeah, sounds good, and I really appreciate all the discussion we had. So follow up on all the bits and pieces from this too. Okay, that's enough for me. I'll see you guys next time. We're not no meeting for no Norbert tomorrow, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And then the last meeting is the following week.
Ooh, wow, that's exciting too. Okay, I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.